She boarded the flight with a quiet smile and a first-class ticket. But when the water spilled, what followed wasn't just a mess. It was a moment that would shake an entire airline to its core. Why? Because they had no idea who she really was. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Zahara Ellison wasn't the kind of woman who tried to stand out. In fact, most days she did her best to blend in. That morning at Savannah Everton Airport, she looked like any other traveler. Maybe a little more tired, maybe a little more careful with how she moved through the crowd. But if you look closely, you'd notice the little things. The way she gently steered her daughter's wheelchair through the terminal, her posture upright but not rigid. The way her eyes scanned each sign like she'd memorized the layout years ago. And the canvas tote bag over her shoulder, frayed at the seams, soft from time, but carried like it meant something. Because it did. Her daughter Nyla was just about 9, with big curious eyes and a stuffed giraffe tucked into her lap like a seatbelt. She wore sneakers that lit up when she tapped her heels, and she was humming a tune that only she seemed to know. Zahara smiled every time the little lights flashed under Nyla's feet. She hadn't heard her hum like that in a long while. The airport buzzed around them with the usual mix of rolling luggage, faint coffee smells, and the occasional echo of someone missing their gate. Zahara wasn't in a rush. She never was, not anymore. Not since Neela's diagnosis. These days she planned everything ahead. Flights, meals, even restroom stops. Every detail mattered when the person you loved most needed the world to slow down just a bit. They reached the security checkpoint, and Zahara handed over their IDs with a soft, "Good morning." The agent glanced at them, gave a polite nod, and waved them through the assisted lane. That part, at least, was smooth. Zahara appreciated those small kindnesses, ones that didn't feel forced, ones that didn't come with eyes that lingered too long. Their flight wasn't until noon, so they found a quiet corner near Gate B14. Neela played a matching game on Zahara's phone, while Zahara reached into her tote bag, pulling out a small, handwritten list. It had notes about snacks, meds, and what to say if Nyla got overwhelmed on the plane. She'd written the list late last night, just after packing, and just before telling herself she'd finally try to sleep. The gate agent called for pre-boarding, and Zahara rose slowly, folding the note and slipping it back into her bag. A few passengers nearby glanced at them. Not out of malice, just that subtle curiosity folks tend to have when they see a wheelchair. Zahara had gotten used to it. She didn't blame them, not really. People looked. It was what they did after that mattered. As they moved down the jet bridge, Neela whispered, "Is it really a window seat?" Zahara grinned. "It's a window seat. You'll see clouds so close you could almost touch them." Nyla beamed, hugging her stuffed giraffe tighter. When they reached the front of the aircraft, a flight attendant greeted them with a smile and a slight tilt of the head. "First class, huh? That's nice," she said, as if surprised. Zahara didn't flinch. She just nodded, her voice even. "Yes, seats 1A and 1B. The attendant checked the manifest, then stepped aside. "All right, welcome aboard." They settled in. Zahara helped Nyla into her seat, making sure her legs were comfortable, and her giraffe had a view too. She adjusted the blanket over her daughter's lap and tucked her tote bag under the seat. For a brief moment, everything felt still. The cabin lights were soft, and the hum of the engine was distant, almost soothing. Zahara leaned back, exhaled, and watched as Neela pressed her nose against the window. This flight wasn't just a vacation. It was something she'd been saving for, dreaming about. A simple trip, sure. But for Nyla, it meant so much more. It meant she could fly, just like any other kid. And for Zahara, it was a reminder that their life, despite everything, wasn't defined by limitations. She reached down, rubbed her thumb along the worn edge of her tote. The bag had belonged to her mother. Canvas, beige, one handle slightly longer than the other. Not the kind you'd see on a fashion blog, but it had held groceries, books, paperwork, and now, plans. Big ones. Across the aisle, a man in a navy blazer glanced over. He gave a polite smile when Zahara met his eye. She returned it, then turned back to Neela, who was now narrating the movement of ground crew vehicles below. It was quiet, peaceful. But somewhere deep inside her, Zahara felt that familiar twinge. That little whisper that said, "Stay alert." She didn't know why. Not yet. But something about today felt different. And as the last few passengers filed in, and a flight attendant with sharp lipstick and an even sharper gaze started moving down the aisle, Zahara's hand instinctively rested over her bag, like a reflex. Just in case, because experience had taught her, calm never lasted long. The plane was filling up now, a steady shuffle of carry-ons and quiet greetings. Neela tapped on the window and pointed at the luggage cart. "That one has our suitcase, I bet," she said proudly. Zahara smiled. "I think you're right. That's the one with the green tag." She glanced across the aisle again. The man in the navy blazer had fallen into his newspaper, the kind that still left ink on your fingers. 2 rows back, a woman was talking softly into a headset, mumbling something about a quarterly report and circling back Monday. All the usual rhythms of travel. But Zahara's attention shifted when she saw a flight attendant step into the aisle with a tray of drinks, plastic cups wobbling gently on their napkins. The woman was young, with a tight blonde bun and a name tag that read Riley. There was a shine to her shoes, the kind that only came from nervous scrubbing, and a too-straight posture that looked rehearsed. Zahara's instincts flickered. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a slight tightness around Riley's mouth when she scanned the first-class cabin, a small shift in her smile when her eyes landed on Zahara and Neela. Zahara had seen that look before. Not hatred, not even discomfort, just question, the quiet, crawling question. "Are you in the right place?" Riley approached, her tray steady, her voice a little too chipper. "Good afternoon. Water, apple juice, or ginger ale?" Zahara kept her tone warm. "Just water for both of us, please." Riley nodded, passed the cups, but her eyes flicked to Zahara's tote bag, the one tucked neatly under the seat, the one with the frayed handle and faded print. A whisper of a frown crossed her face, quick enough to deny, but not quick enough to hide. Then came the spill, a soft jolt. The tray tilted, and a full cup of water tumbled forward, landing squarely in Zahara's lap. The splash was cold and sudden, soaking through her jeans, dripping onto her seat cushion. "Oh my God," Riley gasped, fumbling with napkins. I'm so sorry. That was totally my fault." Zahara sat still. She didn't flinch, just blinked once and looked down at the mess. Neela's eyes went wide. Riley crouched down, pressing the napkins into Zahara's lap with more urgency than care. Zahara gently reached out and stopped her. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Accidents happen." Riley stood, still red-faced. "I'll get you a towel. Do you want me to see if there's a seat cover?" Zahara gave a tight smile. "No need. We're fine." But her eyes followed Riley as she walked away, and the tension didn't leave with her. From the row behind, someone whispered, not loud enough for most to hear, but just enough to catch in Zahara's ear. "That's why you don't bring those old tote bags up here. Looks like someone wandered in from economy." Zahara didn't turn around. Instead, she picked up Neela's giraffe, which had tipped slightly during the commotion, and placed it back in the girl's lap. Neela offered a small, worried smile. "I'm okay, honey," Zahara said. "It's just a little water." But in her chest, something tightened. She knew that voice from behind her. Not the specific person, but the tone. She'd heard it in boardrooms, in waiting rooms, in restaurants where the host hesitated just a second too long before walking her to a window seat. It was the kind of tone that came coated in politeness, but steeped in judgment. And this time, it wasn't just about her. Neela was watching. Back in the galley, Riley was pacing. "I swear it slipped," she muttered to her colleague, a woman in her late 40s with dark curls tucked under her cap. Name tag said Janet. Janet raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" I don't know why she's sitting in 1A, Riley whispered. "She doesn't exactly look like—" Janet didn't let her finish. "Like what?" Riley hesitated. "I just meant that tote bag? I mean, come on. First-class passengers usually carry Toomey, or at least something that doesn't look like it came from a flea market." Janet exhaled, slow and deep. "You ever think that maybe people like her choose to fly under the radar for a reason?" Riley crossed her arms. "I wasn't being rude." You spilled a drink on her and didn't apologize like you meant it. That's rude enough. Riley opened her mouth to reply, then closed it. Janet added, she's sitting with a child in a wheelchair, Riley. Maybe today's not the day to let your gut feeling do the talking. Meanwhile, Zahara leaned against the cool plastic of her seat, trying to ignore the damp fabric beneath her. She looked at Neela, who had gone back to drawing shapes on the foggy part of the window. Innocent, unbothered. That was the only reason Zahara hadn't said more. But her thoughts kept turning. Something about this didn't feel random. She'd flown dozens of times, hundreds really. Long flights, short flights, flights where she wore pearls, flights where she wore sneakers. But every now and then, there'd be one where someone looked at her and quietly decided she didn't fit. She closed her eyes, trying to shake it off. But even with the hum of the engines and the soft voice of the captain announcing their departure, that tension clung to her like the damp on her jeans. Because it wasn't just the spill, it was the look, the tone, the silence from the rows around her, and the quiet, growing feeling that something more was coming, something she couldn't yet see. She adjusted Nyla's blanket once more, then rested her hand over her tote bag, not to hide it, but as a reminder. A reminder of who she was, where she came from, and why she wasn't going to shrink back. Not this time. For the first half hour of the flight, nothing else happened. No more accidents, no more sideways glances, just the steady drone of the engines and the occasional ding from the seatbelt sign. Zahara tried to let it go. She sat back, arms folded loosely across her lap, eyes drifting between the clouds outside and her daughter beside her. Neela had fallen into one of her quiet zones, staring out the window, gently tapping her foot against the seat leg in rhythm with some song only she could hear. Zahara loved that about her, how she could retreat into her own little world when things around her felt too loud or too fast. It was a gift, really. But today, Zahara's mind wouldn't stop spinning. She shifted slightly, the cold dampness from her jeans now just a vague reminder of the earlier spill. She didn't mind the discomfort. It wasn't the water that bothered her. It was everything around it. The tone in the flight attendant's voice, the glances, the way Riley never quite looked her in the eye, and the silence. There'd been at least a dozen other passengers in first class when it happened, and not one person said anything. No one asked if she was all right. No one offered a napkin. Not a single soul even tried to make eye contact after the spill. They just watched, then turned away. That silence, it said more than any comment ever could. Zahara glanced at her reflection in the window. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, a few silver strands escaping near her temples. She wore a navy cotton pullover and plain dark jeans. Not flashy, but clean, presentable, comfortable. Her tote bag rested beneath the seat again, quiet and worn, like it belonged to someone who'd lived through more than she said out loud. She'd chosen that bag on purpose, not because it made a statement, but because it carried history. Her mother used to take it to the library every week, rain or shine. It had grocery receipts older than her daughter and ink stains from Zahara's first speaking engagement. It was part of her, and now apparently it was part of the problem. A subtle ding overhead signaled the cabin crew's movement. Riley passed by again, this time without the tray. Her posture was still rigid, but there was something else in her expression now. A little too stiff, a little too rehearsed, as if she was trying hard to look professional, but couldn't quite relax. Zahara didn't say anything, just watched her pass. "Mom," Neela whispered suddenly, tugging at Zahara's sleeve. "That lady doesn't smile like the other ones." Zahara blinked. "What do you mean, baby?" Neela shrugged. "She only smiles with her mouth, not her eyes. The other lady, the one with curly hair, her eyes smiled too." Zahara looked toward the galley. She caught a glimpse of Janet, the older attendant, handing a warm towel to a passenger. She did smile with her eyes, kind, steady, no pretending. "You've got a sharp eye," Zahara said, brushing her daughter's hair gently off her cheek. "You always notice the things that matter." Back near the galley, Janet was speaking in hushed tones with another crew member. She kept her voice low, but the worry on her face was harder to hide. "She's acting strange," Janet said. "Riley, I mean, this isn't just a bad day." Her colleague, a younger man with tired eyes, nodded. She was already tense before the flight, said she had to prove herself. To who? Janet asked. He shrugged. Everyone, I guess. Janet folded her arms. She's taking it out on passengers. That woman in 1A? She handled the spill with more grace than I've seen in years. But Riley keeps watching her like she's trying to catch her doing something wrong. As they spoke, Riley lingered by the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin. Her jaw clenched slightly, and her eyes were fixed, again, on Zahara's seat. Back in 1A, Zahara noticed it too. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She simply leaned forward, reached for the flight magazine, and flipped it open without reading a word. Her hand was steady, but her thoughts were not, because something was shifting in the air. She could feel it. Not the kind of turbulence that rattled your drink or made passengers gasp. No, this was the kind of current that built slowly, quiet and invisible, until it gathered just enough pressure to knock the balance off. And Zahara had lived long enough to know, when the air felt like that, something was coming. Maybe not today. Maybe not until the wheels touched down. But whatever it was, it had already started. Janet had been working flights long enough to know when something didn't feel right. She kept an eye on Riley without making it obvious, watching the way her colleague lingered too long near certain rows, how her smile tightened whenever she passed Zahara and Nyla, how her movements grew stiff and calculated, like she was building up to something but didn't know how to carry it through. Janet didn't like it. There were patterns you learned to spot in this job, not just passenger behaviors, but crew dynamics too. The flight attendant who overcorrected, the one who let nerves turn into control, and the one who, when unsure of herself, doubled down on the wrong person. And right now, Riley was doubling down. Janet walked the aisle slowly, stopping now and then to adjust a seatbelt here, check on a passenger there. She passed Zahara and gave a small, genuine nod. Zahara met her eyes and returned it, just barely. Back in the galley, Riley stood tapping her tablet screen, brow furrowed. Janet came up beside her. Everything all right? Riley startled slightly. Yeah, just, reviewing manifests. Janet peeked at the screen. For what? I don't know. Riley shrugged. Something feels off about that woman in 1A. I think she's flagged. Janet frowned. Flagged? What do you mean flagged? I don't know yet, Riley said, brushing a piece of hair back behind her ear. She doesn't match the profile. The bag, the way she talks, even the booking name. Something doesn't line up. Janet straightened, her voice low and steady. You're making assumptions. Riley bristled. I'm just being thorough. Janet held her gaze. Or you're looking for something that isn't there. Riley didn't answer. Instead, she turned away and exited the galley, tablet in hand. Zahara sat still, but her mind was turning faster than ever now. Something about Riley's second glance, her hovering, her quiet conversations with crew, it all added up to more than just poor service. It was something deeper, something systemic. She'd seen it before. Back when she was fresh out of grad school, traveling with her startup team. Back when they thought wearing blazers and carrying MacBooks would protect them from raised eyebrows at airport lounges. It never did. She remembered one trip in particular. Denver to Houston. She'd worn a suit that day. Tailored, dark gray, sat in the front row of business class. The flight attendant had asked if she was in the right seat before even scanning her ticket. Zahara hadn't responded, just held out her boarding pass. When the scanner beeped green, the woman had smiled, said, "Oh, you're with the foundation team." Like that changed anything. It hadn't changed how it felt. Today wasn't that different. Except now she wasn't a 27-year-old trying to prove herself. She was 41, worn in the best and worst ways. She'd built organizations, funded programs, and worked with government agencies. And she still couldn't get on a plane without someone trying to figure out if she belonged. Neela reached for her juice. Mom, can I tell you something? Zahara turned, softening. Of course, baby. I think that lady is mad at you, Neela said quietly. Zahara blinked. Why do you think that? She looks like the teacher at my old school, the one who got mad when I couldn't go up the stairs fast. Zahara's chest tightened. You remember that? Neela nodded. She had that same kind of face. Zahara took her daughter's hand and held it gently. Sometimes people get uncomfortable when they don't understand someone else's life. It's not your fault, or mine. Neela looked down. But I didn't do anything. You don't have to, Zahara whispered. Some folks write stories about you before you ever say a word. Up front, Riley was hunched over her tablet again. Her thumb hovered above a line on the screen, an internal security check form. It wasn't protocol to run a passenger through extra verification without cause, but part of her felt justified. She'd seen odd things before. People sneaking into upgraded seats, fake tickets, disruptions. Better to be proactive, right? She tapped the screen. Flag request, passenger in seat 1A. Suspicious inconsistency, requesting confirmation. The message flew off into the internal system, disappearing into the digital maze of airline servers. Riley exhaled slowly, trying to calm the thrum in her chest. Behind her, Janet returned to the galley. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the tension in Riley's shoulders. Then she glanced out at the cabin and saw Zahara sitting calmly, her hand resting protectively over her daughter's. There was no disruption. There was no scene. Just a woman who'd come to fly with her child and had somehow become a question mark in someone else's story. And as the plane continued to hum along at 30,000 feet, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that something very wrong was starting to unfold, and that the whole cabin might soon feel it, whether they were ready for it or not. Malachi Wynn had been flying commercial for nearly 12 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times he'd been called out of the cockpit mid-flight for something non-mechanical. Most matters in the cabin were handled quietly. Spills, passenger complaints, the occasional medical scare. But today his co-pilot gave him a subtle look over the console and said, "There's a situation brewing in first class. You might want to hear about it." Malachi didn't move right away. He took a slow sip from the thermos in his lap and stared at the flight path glowing across the screen in front of him. Then he leaned forward, tapped his comms button, and spoke into the intercom, just loud enough for the cabin crew to hear. "Galley, this is the cockpit. Is everything running smooth up front?" A moment later, Janet's voice came through, low and measured. "We've got a growing concern with a passenger in 1A. Might be best to keep an eye on it." That was all he needed. Malachi stood, nodded to the co-pilot, and made his way through the quiet front section. As he reached the galley, he found Janet waiting with her arms crossed and eyes like steel. "It's Riley," she said under her breath. "She flagged a passenger. No incident, no cause." Malachi's brows pulled together. "1A?" Janet nodded. "She's flying with a child in a wheelchair. No disturbance, no conflict, just assumptions." He didn't respond right away. He turned slightly and peeked down the aisle. From where he stood, he could see Zahara's profile. Calm, unreadable, her daughter curled up against the side of the window like any other child trying to make the sky feel small enough to nap in. She flagged her for what exactly? Janet shrugged. "That's what I'd like to know." Riley entered the galley from the other side a few seconds later. She seemed surprised to see Malachi there, standing in full uniform, cap tucked beneath his arm. "Oh, Captain, I didn't mean to escalate," she started. Malachi kept his tone even. "You flagged a first-class passenger in mid-flight. That's not something we take lightly." "She was acting suspicious," Riley said quickly. "There was an issue earlier with a drink spill, and her behavior has been off. I just wanted to confirm her credentials." "You mean her ticket?" he asked, his voice flat. Riley hesitated. "Among other things." Malachi blinked slowly, then stepped back and folded his arms. "Tell me exactly what she did to raise suspicion." Riley flinched slightly under his gaze. "She carries this old bag. Doesn't match the profile of someone in 1A. She didn't respond like most passengers when the spill happened, and she keeps glancing at the crew. It feels like she's testing us." Janet sighed quietly, but didn't say a word. Malachi took a moment, then leaned in just enough to lower his voice. "You're describing a mother traveling with her disabled daughter, who, from what I can see, has caused zero disruption and handled your mistake with grace." Riley's lips parted, but nothing came out. "This isn't protocol," Malachi continued. "It's prejudice disguised as procedure. And if you don't understand the difference, you're flying in the wrong direction." Riley stepped back. "I didn't mean to." He cut her off gently. You did. Maybe not out of malice, but meaning well doesn't change outcomes. Behind them, a faint chime echoed, the seatbelt sign blinking on overhead. Some light turbulence, nothing major. But in the space between that chime and the next word, something else shifted. Something heavier than cabin pressure. Back in her seat, Zahara had noticed the exchange. She couldn't hear every word, but she saw the stance. Saw Riley's posture, the captain's body language, the way Janet stood with quiet strength. And she knew, just knew, the conversation wasn't about drink service. Her phone vibrated lightly in her coat pocket, a message from one of her senior advisors back in Seattle. We've been contacted by Ether Sky Corporate about a pending inquiry. They're asking if you're traveling. Zahara stared at the message. No other details. She closed her eyes and breathed through her nose, steady and deep. She hadn't told anyone at the airline she was flying today. She'd booked the tickets through a silent grant fund under her foundation's name. She hadn't used her executive credentials. No one on board should have known who she was, but someone must have dug deeper. And now? Now they were starting to realize exactly who they were watching. She looked down at Neela, still dozing softly with her giraffe clutched under her chin. For a moment, she let herself feel the ache behind her eyes, not just from fatigue, but from the truth pressing down on her. No matter how much good you've done, how quietly you try to move, some people still need to see proof before they grant you humanity. And others? Others only see what they want to see. Riley returned to the aisle with a hollow expression. She didn't meet Zahara's eyes. Zahara didn't flinch. She simply turned her head toward the window, her voice low but steady as she murmured to herself, "They're looking for credentials when the only thing I brought was dignity." The seatbelt sign turned off again with a soft chime, but it didn't bring much relief. Zahara sat still, her fingers laced loosely in her lap, the cold from the earlier spill long dried, but not forgotten. She hadn't moved much, didn't want to give anyone reason to think she was restless or agitated or anything other than composed. She knew how quickly calm could be mistaken for something else when it came from someone like her. Neela stirred beside her, rubbing her eyes. "Are we there yet?" she mumbled. Zahara brushed her hand gently across her daughter's forehead. "Not yet, baby, but we're getting close." Neela nodded and reached for her giraffe, hugging it tighter. There was something grounding about that little stuffed animal, its frayed ears, its faded yellow. It had been through surgeries and hospital nights, through TSA pat-downs and too many looks that lingered. In some ways, it had seen more than most adults. Up near the galley, Riley was pacing again. The message she'd sent, flagging Zahara, hadn't gone unnoticed. A response had come through from ground control. Passenger ticket confirmed. No inconsistencies found. Traveling under verified foundation sponsorship. Do not escalate. But that wasn't the worst part. Right beneath it, another line had appeared, tagged from the legal department. This passenger holds a direct financial stake in current equity initiative. Handle with discretion. Riley stared at the screen. Her hands began to sweat. It was only then that she realized she'd made a mistake. A serious one. And it wasn't just about protocol anymore. It was about who Zahara really was. She walked quickly back to Janet, who was reviewing inventory logs in the galley. "I think I messed up," Riley whispered, voice dry. Janet didn't look up. "You think? I didn't know who she was." "You didn't need to," Janet replied evenly. "You just needed to treat her like everyone else." Riley leaned against the wall, chest rising and falling a little too fast. "What do I do?" Janet finally looked at her, calm and clear-eyed. "You fix it, or it'll fix you." Across the cabin, a businessman a few rows behind Zahara pulled out his phone and discreetly started recording. He hadn't said anything during the spill, or when Riley hovered. But now, with tension visible in the galley and quiet ripples spreading through the cabin, he did what a lot of people do these days. He captured it. "First class, flight 448, he whispered into the mic. "They flagged a woman for no reason. She's just sitting there with her kid." Zahara didn't see the camera. She was helping Neela put on her headphones, letting the child settle into a cartoon she'd downloaded the night before. The small screen glowed against Nyla's sleepy face, casting her in soft light. But Zahara felt something shift. That kind of shift that doesn't have sound or warning, but you feel it in your spine. The curtain between first class and the rest of the cabin rustled, and Malachi Wynn, still in uniform, stepped through. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded politely as he made his way to Zahara's row. The aisle cleared for him like the air parted on its own. "Miss Ellison?" he said gently. Zahara looked up, her voice steady. "Yes, Captain." He crouched slightly to her eye level, careful not to make a scene. "I want to apologize for the confusion. There's been a miscommunication." Zahara tilted her head. "What kind of miscommunication?" "The kind that shouldn't have happened," he said. "Your ticket, your presence. It's all in order. I've already spoken with the crew. I'm deeply sorry for any discomfort." Zahara didn't blink. "Captain Wynn, I've flown 100 flights in the last 10 years. Not once have I been escorted to apologize to." "I understand," he said quietly, "but sometimes silence speaks louder than action." Zahara glanced briefly at Riley, who was standing stiff by the galley curtain, trying her best not to look over. Then she looked back at the captain. "Is this your way of telling me she'll be held accountable?" "I can't speak to personnel decisions mid-flight," he replied honestly, "but I can promise, this won't be brushed off." Zahara studied him. There was no bluff in his tone. She nodded once. "Then I hope that promise holds after the landing gear comes down." As Malachi stood and stepped away, the silence in the cabin thickened. The passengers, once disengaged, were now fully alert. Whispers moved like soft waves through the rows. Not loud, not chaotic, but heavy. Like everyone had just realized they were part of something bigger than a plane ride. Riley turned to leave the galley, but Janet stopped her with a glance. "You might want to wait," she said. "She's not done with you yet." Riley swallowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Janet said quietly, "you didn't just spill water today." Zahara shifted in her seat, her back straight, her gaze distant. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved from her place. But somehow, without a single word of protest, she'd changed the tone of the entire flight. And deep down, she knew. The real turbulence hadn't even started yet. The sun had started to dip low on the horizon, casting a warm gold over the plane's wing. From her seat in 1A, Zahara could see the clouds shift into hues of amber and rose. Beautiful, distant, untouchable. Nyla was still tucked in beside her, small headphones over her ears, lost in whatever gentle cartoon world was unfolding on the screen. But Zahara couldn't relax. She stared out the window, but her mind was far from the view. It was circling a question that had been echoing since takeoff. How many times does a person have to prove they belong before they're simply allowed to be? Across the aisle, no one spoke to her, but she could feel them watching now. Their silence had changed. Not the polite sort of indifference that made someone invisible, but the sharp-edged awareness of people who finally realized they'd been part of something wrong, even if they hadn't said a word. And yet no one spoke up. Still, the captain's apology had landed softly, polished, respectful. But Zahara knew it wouldn't be the end of it. Not really. Not with a flight attendant still hovering behind a curtain, trying not to meet her eyes. Not with whispers pulsing through the cabin like a slow, contagious current. Janet approached again, walking carefully as if mindful of the tension still hanging in the air. "Ms. Ellison," she said quietly, "may I speak with you for a moment, in private?" Zahara glanced at Neela. The little girl was fully absorbed in her show, humming softly under her breath. Zahara nodded, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stood. Janet led her toward the galley with quiet, deliberate steps. As they passed through the narrow aisle, Zahara could feel the weight of eyes behind her. She didn't rush. She never did. Moving slowly, moving with control, that was how she kept her balance. Inside the galley, the curtains swished shut behind them. Riley was already there, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a line. She stood like someone bracing for impact. Zahara looked at her, not with anger, but with the kind of measured clarity that came from years of navigating rooms where she was underestimated, dismissed, then later asked to fix the very thing she'd been excluded from. "I understand," Zahara said calmly, that you made certain assumptions about me today? Riley looked away. It wasn't personal. Zahara raised an eyebrow. Number, that's what makes it worse. Riley's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. You didn't know who I was, Zahara continued. So you thought it was safe. You thought the worst thing that could happen was a flagged form or a quiet note in a report. I thought there was something off. You thought I didn't belong, Zahara said, not cruelly, but with a steadiness that cut deeper than shouting ever could. Because of the bag, because of my clothes, because I didn't act the way you expected. That's all it took. Riley swallowed hard. I didn't mean to judge you. But you did, Zahara said, and now you've been seen. Janet shifted slightly but didn't interrupt. She was there as a witness now, someone who understood the gravity of the moment and chose to hold space for it. Zahara turned slightly, arms relaxed at her sides. You have no idea how many of us walk around every day carrying more than you'll ever see. Stories, wounds, strength, and yet we still get asked to prove something. Riley's voice cracked. I didn't think. No, Zahara said softly. You didn't. That's the point. The galley fell into silence. Not tense, not sharp, but thick, like the air just before a storm breaks. Zahara took a step closer, not threatening, just present, rooted. You need to understand something, she said. This flight isn't about me anymore. It's about what happens next. Because every time someone like you makes someone like me feel small, we either shrink or we rise. Riley stood frozen. Her eyes were glassy now, the heat behind them threatening to spill, but she held it in. Zahara exhaled long and slow. I'm not here to ruin your career. I'm here to ask what kind of woman you want to be after this. She didn't wait for a response. She turned, brushed the curtain aside, and stepped back into the cabin. The light had changed again, softer now, dusk settling in. The hum of the engines filled the silence as Zahara walked back to her seat and sat down beside her daughter. Neela looked up at her, blinking sleepily. Where'd you go? Just stretching my legs, sweetheart, Zahara whispered, brushing a curl away from her daughter's forehead. Nothing to worry about. She adjusted the blanket around Nyla's lap, then settled back in, eyes drifting to the window again. Outside, the sky was turning the color of deep steel, the kind of blue that comes just before nightfall, just before the lights come on. Inside, things were shifting too, because while the flight wasn't over yet, a line had been crossed, and Zahara Ellison had no intention of letting it fade into silence. The flight began its descent into Seattle, and the hum of the cabin took on a new rhythm. Seat backs clicked upright, tray tables snapped closed, and passengers started gathering their quiet messes like nothing had happened. But the air still held that same charge, that hush that settles in when people sense they've witnessed something important but don't quite know how to name it. Zahara sat calmly, helping Neela with her shoes, her motions practiced and soft. The girl had dozed off for a bit, but now she was alert again, eyes still puffy, her little voice full of mourning. Are we almost there? Zahara smiled, kissing her forehead. Just a little longer. You did great. Across the aisle, a man with a loosened tie cleared his throat and glanced her way. He didn't say anything, but this time, the glance held something else. Apology, maybe, or at least recognition. Zahara didn't return it, not out of anger, just because she was tired. Behind her, Riley stood near the galley, her hands fidgeting with a safety pamphlet she wasn't reading. She'd spent the last 20 minutes trying to decide whether to say something more, to offer another apology, one with less defense and more truth. But the words wouldn't come. Not yet. Janet walked by, pausing briefly by Zahara's row. She leaned down slightly, her voice warm and private. I just wanted to thank you, she said, for handling today with more grace than most would have. Zahara looked up, her face still. It shouldn't have required grace. Janet nodded slowly. No, it shouldn't have. They held each other's gaze a moment longer. Then Janet straightened and moved on, checking final seatbelts. The plane touched down with a subtle thud, the kind you barely feel unless you're waiting for something to jolt you. As the wheels rolled beneath them, Zahara felt it, this quiet shift inside her, like something old had loosened its grip, and something new was waiting just outside the gate. Passengers stood, stretching and reaching for bags, the usual shuffle to escape the cramped space. But Zahara didn't rush. She sat with her tote bag in her lap, Nyla's fingers tucked into hers, steady and small. A woman from 3 rows back paused near their seats on the way out. "I just wanted to say," she murmured, eyes not quite meeting Zahara's, "I saw what happened. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Zahara gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said simply. The woman hesitated, then moved on, her footsteps quicker than before. One by one, the cabin emptied. Riley remained at the front, greeting passengers mechanically. "Thanks for flying with us. Have a good evening." When Zahara and Neela finally stepped into the aisle, Riley straightened. Her throat tightened. She opened her mouth, but Zahara didn't stop walking. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive. It was just done. Until Nyla tugged gently at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "She looks sad." Zahara glanced back. Riley stood there, eyes wide and red-rimmed, her mouth trembling around unspoken words. Zahara paused, then turned halfway, meeting Riley's eyes fully. "Next time," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "don't wait to learn the truth before you offer respect. That's not how dignity works." Riley nodded once, small, sharp, ashamed. Zahara turned again, walking forward with her daughter, the terminal lights glowing ahead like a runway of their own. The airport smelled of coffee and concrete, familiar and impersonal. But tonight it felt different, heavier, like something had cracked open mid-flight, and now the world was watching to see what would be done with it. They moved past the gate and toward baggage claim, Neela's chair rolling smoothly over the tile. A few people glanced their way. One man tipped his head slightly in recognition. A couple whispered, but Zahara didn't stop. As they waited by the carousel, her phone buzzed in her pocket. An email. From the airline's regional office. Subject: Flight 448. Internal report. Request executive follow-up needed. Zahara read the subject line twice, then slid the phone back into her coat without opening it. She already knew what it would say. Some version of concern, some version of corporate regret. What mattered now wasn't the apology, it was the opportunity, because sometimes change doesn't come after the cameras roll or the news stories break. Sometimes it starts in the quiet, with a single seat, a single child, a single mother who refused to shrink. Zahara looked down at Neela, who had turned her giraffe into a puppet and was making it talk to the suitcase going around the carousel. She smiled softly, reached down and said, "You ready to go change the world, baby girl?" Neela grinned. "Can we get pancakes first?" Zahara chuckled. "You drive a hard bargain." And as they rolled away into the city, Zahara didn't look back. She didn't need to. The story was already moving forward. The next morning, Zahara Ellison sat by the hotel window with a coffee she hadn't touched and a silence she hadn't earned. Seattle's early sun crept lazily through the curtains, casting a pale yellow hue across the carpet. Neela was still asleep in the adjoining room, curled in a fortress of pillows and blankets, her giraffe peeking out from under the edge like a sentry on watch. Zahara's phone buzzed again. Another email. This one had a subject line that made her heart pause. Confidential, passenger profile circulated internally without authorization. She opened it. The message was brief, clinical. An internal report from Ether Sky Airlines had been leaked. An incident note tied to Flight 448. Someone on the flight had pulled her full name, cross-referenced it with public records, and sent a profile of her background to the corporate office, highlighting her role as co-founder of the Ellison Project, her prior TEDx talks, her board seat at a major urban policy think tank. It wasn't supposed to happen, not under a quiet booking, not when she traveled using foundation credentials. But someone on that flight had dug, and now the airline knew exactly who she was. Zahara leaned back in the chair and exhaled through her nose. She wasn't surprised. Not really. She'd kept her name out of the booking on purpose. Not to hide, but to observe. To see if the systems she helped fund were working on the ground, not just on paper. Well, she'd gotten her answer. What shook her wasn't that she'd been flagged. It was that someone in that cabin, likely a crew member, had gone looking for a reason to justify the suspicion. And when they didn't find one, they'd gone deeper, until her name popped up in a place it didn't belong. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from her operations director back in D.C. "It's already moving." 3 national outlets picked up the passenger video. "Board wants to know if you'll go public." Zahara stared at the message. She hadn't asked for this, but she also wasn't about to let it die quietly. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and after a few seconds, she typed, "Let them know I'll release a statement. Noon. My terms." She slid the phone onto the table and finally sipped her coffee. It had gone cold. Down the hall, Neela called out sleepily, "Mom?" Zahara stood, pulled the curtains wider, and let the morning light flood in. "Coming, baby," she said. But her mind was already elsewhere, piecing together what came next. Across town, inside Ether Sky's regional headquarters, the tension in the executive suite was thick. The CEO, Dalton Reese, held a printed copy of Zahara's flagged passenger record in one hand, a legal report in the other. The room was silent except for the low hum of the projector fan. "I want to know exactly how this happened," he said. The chief of staff cleared her throat. "It appears someone on board, likely a crew member, searched her name after the incident. That triggered an internal record pull. The report was never meant to be elevated beyond cabin logs." Dalton's jaw clenched. "And yet, it was." The room fell quiet again. "She's already responded to our inquiry," another executive said. "She's crafting a public statement. She's not naming names yet, but she's not letting this slide." Dalton looked at the legal counsel. "What's our exposure?" "Significant," the lawyer replied, "but the bigger issue is optics. Zahara Ellison is not just a private citizen. She's been a donor to transit equity programs, and she's testified before the Senate on transportation discrimination. If she speaks up, this becomes national." "It already is," Dalton muttered, tapping the desk with his knuckle. "We just haven't caught up yet." Back at the hotel, Zahara sat on the bed beside Neela, brushing her hair gently. The little girl leaned into her side, humming quietly, content in the way only kids can be when they trust the world around them. Zahara envied that. "Do you have to work today?" Neela asked. Zahara smiled faintly. "A little bit, but nothing that can't wait until after waffles." Neela giggled and stretched her arms. "Waffles first, work second. That's the rule." Zahara kissed her temple. "That's the rule." But even as she got them ready for breakfast, packed Nyla's backpack, and called down to the front desk to request a wheelchair van, her mind stayed on the bigger picture. This wasn't about her anymore. It never really was. Because what Riley did, the suspicion, the second-guessing, the flag, it wasn't isolated. It was part of something wider, quieter, and harder to name until it happened to you. But now it had a name, and by noon, it would have a voice. It was 5 minutes to noon when Zahara stood at the window again, this time in a tailored navy blue jacket over jeans, a quiet kind of authority in her posture. Her laptop sat open on the desk beside her, camera already angled. The press briefing wasn't formal, just a recorded video, filmed by her team, set to go live on her foundation's public channels. But the moment was far from small. Outside, the streets of downtown Seattle moved like any weekday. Horns, footsteps, someone shouting for coffee. But inside this quiet room, something was shifting, something Zahara had spent years preparing for, though she never hoped she'd need it like this. Across the suite, Neela sat at the little round table with a coloring book and her stuffed giraffe, humming softly to herself, blissfully unaware that her mother was about to step into a storm. Or maybe, create one. Zahara glanced once more at the email from her communications director. "Media outlets on standby. Airline's PR team has gone quiet since your legal inquiry hit. Everyone's waiting to see how far you'll take this." She smiled faintly, not out of pride, out of clarity. Then with a deep breath, she clicked record. Her eyes met the lens, not with fire, not with anger, but with something firmer, resolve. "My name is Zahara Ellison," she began. "Yesterday I boarded Ether Sky Flight 448 with my daughter. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, nothing special, but before we even left the ground, I was reminded of something I already knew, that dignity in this country still too often depends on what you look like, or who people think you are. She paused, letting the words breathe. A flight attendant spilled a drink on me. That was an accident. What came next wasn't. I was flagged, questioned, watched. Not because I caused a disturbance or failed to follow protocol, but because I didn't fit someone's idea of who should be sitting in one. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about patterns. Quiet ones. Insidious ones. The kind that don't make headlines until someone pulls out a phone. The kind that leave people exhausted, erased, and tired of explaining their existence to systems that were never built with them in mind. Zahara leaned forward slightly. Let me be clear. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel like a guest in a space they paid to enter. It's about the Black mothers traveling alone with their kids, the disabled passengers, the quiet ones, the ones who get the side eyes, the double checks, the silent judgment. Another breath. Ether Sky says they're reviewing the incident. I hope they are, but review is not enough. We need accountability. We need training that doesn't just live in binders. We need a cultural shift that starts with listening to people when they say, "This happens all the time." She softened then, but didn't break. I didn't want to go public. I wanted to protect my daughter, but protecting her doesn't just mean shielding her from pain. It means teaching her how to stand up when dignity is denied. And that's what this moment is. She sat back, folding her hands. We don't want sympathy. We want change. And we're not waiting quietly for it anymore. Click. She ended the recording. Within the hour, the video was live. Within 2, it had been viewed over 100,000 times. By late afternoon, it was playing on cable news, showing clips of Zahara's calm face paired with headlines like, "Mother speaks out after discrimination aboard Ether Sky flight." We want change. Passenger calls for reform in airline industry. Back at Ether Sky's corporate HQ, Dalton Reese sat in a glass-walled office watching the video with his legal and PR teams. No one spoke. Finally, he set his coffee down and said, "We waited too long." The legal advisor nodded. "It's a narrative now. You can't spin your way out." "What's the board's position?" Dalton asked. "They want a meeting. With her. Immediately." "Do we make a public apology?" The comms director hesitated. "Only if we're ready to back it with action." Dalton looked down at his desk. His company had spent years building an image of inclusivity. Ads featuring smiling, diverse families, partnerships with accessibility advocates, glossy brochures about equity. But one flight, one moment, had torn through the branding and exposed the truth underneath. That it wasn't just about policies, it was about people, and the failure to see them clearly. He stood. "Set the meeting," he said, "and make sure she knows it's not just for show." Back at the hotel, Zahara sat on the edge of the bed, Neela's head resting against her side. She scrolled through the messages pouring into her inbox, some angry, some thankful, many heartbreaking. People sharing stories from airports, from trains, from hotel lobbies, stories that mirrored her own in ways she hadn't expected. She read everyone, not out of obligation, but because she knew what it meant to finally feel seen. Then came the message she had been waiting for. Subject, request for in-person meeting, Ether Sky Executive Board. She opened it. The date was set, the location, their national HQ, just 2 days from now. Zahara looked at her daughter, who had fallen asleep again, lips parted slightly, hands still clinging to that faded giraffe, and she whispered, not to anyone in particular, "We're not finished yet." Because truth, it doesn't wait to be asked. It knocks, then walks right in. 2 days later, Zahara Ellison stepped through the mirrored glass doors of Ether Sky's national headquarters with the kind of silence that wasn't meant to go unnoticed. No entourage, no camera crew, just her, a soft leather folder tucked under one arm, and a look that said she'd walked into bigger rooms than this and left them changed. The lobby was all polished stone and minimalist decor, the kind of modern sterile meant to impress without feeling personal. But it didn't faze her. She'd seen too many spaces like it, too many places where decisions were made by people who never had to live with them. A young assistant with a badge that read Eli approached quickly. flustered but trying not to show it. "Ms. Ellison, right this way. They're waiting in the executive conference suite." Zahara gave a nod, calm as ever. "Lead the way." As they walked through the hallway, she caught glimpses of framed photos, diverse crews in stage smiles, slogans like "Elevate Equity" and "Everyone Flies First." All the right words. None of them had stopped Riley from doing what she did. The elevator opened directly into a top-floor suite. Glass walls, a long curved table, city skyline in every direction. A dozen people sat waiting. Executives in tailored suits, legal counsel, a diversity officer she vaguely recognized from a recent panel. Dalton Reese stood at the head of the table. He extended a hand as she entered. "Ms. Ellison," he said carefully, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Zahara shook his hand, firm, brief. "I'm not here to be handled," she said softly, "so let's skip the preambles." Dalton cleared his throat, nodding. "Understood. Please have a seat." She did, and when she spoke, it wasn't with a presentation. It wasn't polished like a keynote. It was quiet, deliberate, like someone setting down heavy stones, one by one, onto a table they were never supposed to sit at in the first place. "I didn't ask to be a symbol," she said. "I bought a seat. I boarded quietly, and I was made to feel like I didn't belong, not because of anything I said or did, but because someone looked at me and made a decision." She paused. No one interrupted. "I've spent 20 years working in spaces like this, helping organizations like yours create equity programs, fund community pilots, write public policy statements. But what happened on that flight reminded me, no amount of branding or boilerplate can fix what a culture refuses to confront." She opened her folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the table toward Dalton. "This is what I'm asking for." He scanned it quickly, his face tightening as he read the clear, simple demands. Immediate third-party review of all bias-related passenger flagging protocols, mandatory in-person equity training for frontline crew. Not digital modules. A public apology not just to her, but to the broader community. A multi-million-dollar commitment to a passenger equity fund, managed independently. Dalton looked up. "This is significant." Zahara didn't blink. So was the silence on that flight. Another executive leaned forward, clasping her hands. "If we commit to these steps, will you go public in support?" Zahara tilted her head. "Number, you don't buy goodwill with money. You earn it with action. I'll speak when I see results, when your passengers feel the change, not when your lawyers sign off." Dalton leaned back. "And if we say no?" Zahara stood slowly, gathering her folder. "Then I'll take my seat at another table. The kind built by people who've been left out of rooms like this for far too long." The room was still. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "But I think you already know. This moment's bigger than all of us now. And the story, it's not going away." As she turned to leave, Dalton called after her. "We'll review the proposal. You'll hear from us by end of week." Zahara didn't break stride. "I'll wait, but the world won't." Outside the building, the air was cool and sharp, and the city moved around her like it always had. Fast, indifferent, half listening. She walked slowly, her phone buzzing in her pocket with messages she didn't rush to check. Because she'd already said what she needed to say. And this time, they heard her. Not just in the room, but everywhere. That night, Zahara sat in her hotel room again, but not in front of a camera and not at her laptop. This time she was barefoot, curled into the corner of the couch, with a cup of chamomile tea in her hand and a blanket tossed across her legs. The hum of the city outside was faint, but steady, like something big breathing just beneath the surface. Neela was asleep, finally, after pancakes and cartoons and a long FaceTime call with her uncle back home. She'd knocked out hard, her little giraffe tucked under one arm, her other hand still gripping Zahara's pinky as she drifted off. It had been a long day, not loud, not chaotic, but long in the kind of way that makes you feel every inch of your spine when you finally sit still. Zahara checked her phone one last time. No email from Dalton Reese, not yet, but she wasn't surprised. You don't shift a culture with a signature, you rattle it first. And today, she had done just that. On social media, her statement video had passed 1 million views. National anchors were quoting her. Advocacy groups had started tagging Ether Sky in public campaigns. And passengers, so many passengers, were sharing their own stories now. Not in anger necessarily, in recognition. This happened to me in Denver. I was told to prove my seat while holding my boarding pass. My wheelchair was taken apart without asking. They assumed my husband paid for the upgrade. Each post echoed like footsteps in a hallway that had once been empty. Now, the silence was starting to tremble, and Zahara, she wasn't backing down. Her phone buzzed with a text, this one from Janet. If no one else says it, thank you. You made us look at ourselves. Zahara stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, looking is the first step. Changing is the work. She set the phone on the nightstand and leaned her head back. Somewhere deep down, she could still feel Riley's eyes on her. The stiffness in the galley, the hesitations, the way she had held the tablet like a shield. Zahara didn't hate her. She didn't even feel vindictive. What she felt, what stayed with her, was how quick suspicion had been and how slow the apology was to follow. That imbalance, it's what ate at people, quietly, until it built into something too big to ignore. Across town, in a private boardroom, Dalton Reese sat at the same long table from earlier, this time surrounded only by a core group of three, his general counsel, his equity lead, and his HR chief. He held Zahara's proposal in one hand. His other hand tapped against the table in a slow, rhythmic loop. Do you think she'll walk if we stall? He asked finally. No, said the equity lead. She doesn't need you. That's why she's so dangerous. She can keep speaking, and people will keep listening. The legal counsel spoke next. If we don't move forward, we'll look like we're hiding. And if that video keeps gaining traction, this becomes more than a PR issue. It becomes a case study. Dalton sighed. She's calm, but I can tell she's not letting this go. No, said the HR chief. She's the kind of calm you get from being dismissed your whole life and surviving it. He sat back and rubbed his temples. Get the board back on Thursday, he said. We vote on full implementation. What about the apology? The counsel asked. Dalton stared out the window. We wait until we've earned it. Back at the hotel, Zahara finally let her shoulders drop. She wasn't tired in the way most people meant it. She was tired in the bones. But behind the fatigue was something else. A thrum, a pulse, momentum. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. It wasn't about one flight anymore. Not even about one company. It was about what people do when they realize that being quiet has cost them too much. And now, the quiet had been broken. Tomorrow, they'd see if it could be rebuilt into something better. But for tonight, she allowed herself something she hadn't felt in days. A small breath, and the quiet kind of hope that doesn't demand anything except the will to keep going. 3 days later, Zahara walked into the Ether Sky boardroom again. But this time, they were already standing. Every executive in the room rose as she entered. Not performatively, not out of pageantry, but because something unspoken had shifted. This wasn't the woman from Seat 1A anymore. This was the woman who had exposed a fracture in their foundation and dared them to do more than paper over the cracks. Dalton Reese gestured to the empty chair at the table's head. Miss Ellison, he said, we'd like you to sit here today. Zahara paused for half a second, then stepped forward, her heels tapping lightly against the stone floor. She didn't need the seat to know she already had the power, but she took it anyway. Dalton began with a statement. The board met this morning. We've reviewed your proposal in full, and I want you to hear it from me directly. We're accepting every point. In full, no one breathed. He continued. The third-party audit begins next week. In-person training will be developed with external partners. You're welcome to suggest names. The public apology will be issued once implementation begins. And the equity fund, it'll launch within the quarter, co-managed by your foundation if you choose. Zahara nodded once, not from surprise, but from confirmation. I appreciate the clarity, she said, and I appreciate the accountability. But let's be honest about what this is. A start, not a solution. Dalton didn't argue. He just said, we know. Zahara's eyes moved around the room, locking onto each executive for a moment, holding them there. I'm not here to destroy your company, she said. but I am here to make sure it doesn't get to pat itself on the back before doing the real work." She opened a thin folder on the table. Inside was a list of 6 passengers who had written to her privately, people who had experienced similar treatment on Ether Sky flights in the last 2 years. "Start by reaching out to them," she said, sliding the sheet across the table. "Not with a coupon, with an apology and a promise to listen." A silence followed, but it wasn't stiff. It was sobering. Dalton took the sheet, glanced at the names, then nodded. "Consider it done." One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with salt and pepper curls, leaned forward. "Miss Ellison, Zahara, may I ask you something?" Zahara turned slightly. "Yes." The woman's voice was low, thoughtful. "How did you stay so calm when it happened?" Zahara exhaled through her nose, not as a sigh, but as a release, a truth. "I didn't stay calm," she said. "I carried years of restraint in that seat, years of being second-guessed, over-explaining, smiling when I didn't want to. That wasn't calm, that was practice." The woman nodded slowly. "And what made you finally speak?" Zahara looked at her, then at every person in the room. "My daughter," she said simply, "because someday she'll sit where I sat, and I won't always be there to speak for her." The room stilled again, but this time it didn't feel frozen. It felt focused, real. Dalton stood. "We'll be releasing the apology statement tomorrow. Would you like to approve the language?" Zahara stood too, gathering her notes. "No," she said. "That's your voice, not mine." She turned to the door, then paused. "But I will be watching." As she walked out, no one stopped her. No one needed to. They knew, when someone like Zahara looks you in the eye and says, "Do better," you don't get a second chance to pretend you didn't hear her. You either change, or you get left behind. And from the look in her eyes, she was already 10 steps ahead. The next morning, Zahara woke early, before the city, before the headlines, before the phone started buzzing again. She stood by the hotel window, watching the sky shift from dark blue to that soft ash gray that always came before dawn. For the first time in days, the silence felt earned. No firestorms to put out, no cameras. Just breathe. And possibility. She walked quietly into Nyla's room and watched her sleep for a moment. The little girl had kicked off her blanket again, her usual habit, and was sprawled diagonally across the bed, one sock missing, giraffe half hanging off the pillow. Zahara smiled softly, leaned down, and tucked the blanket around her daughter's shoulders. Then she whispered the same thing she always whispered when she needed strength more than sleep. "Keep going." At 8 a.m. sharp, her phone buzzed. Subject, final apology statement, Ether Sky Air. She opened it slowly. The message was short, no fanfare. Just the statement they would be releasing in every major publication and media outlet that afternoon. "To our passengers, our crew, and our community, on Flight 448, we failed. Not in policy, in principle. One of our passengers, Zahara Ellison, was made to feel like she did not belong, despite doing everything right. She was judged before she was known, questioned before she was greeted, assumed to be out of place because of how she looked, not because of who she was. We've come to understand that this moment is not isolated. It is a symptom, a reflection of blind spots we can no longer afford. As of today, we are launching a comprehensive audit of all passenger treatment protocols, bias response training, and equity policies. We are also committing $7.5 million to a new passenger equity fund, co-designed with national civil rights organizations and community leaders. But money doesn't fix culture. People do. We thank Ms. Ellison for challenging us to be better. We hope every passenger who has ever felt unseen or unvalued knows we are listening now, and we're changing. Signed, Dalton Reese, CEO. Ether Sky Air. Zahara read it twice. Not because she doubted it, she didn't, but because it felt like something rare. Not just an apology crafted by a legal team, but a reckoning written by someone who finally got it. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Janet. "You didn't just cross a line, you moved it." Zahara typed back, "One step at a time." Across the city, news anchors were already reading the statement aloud. Social media feeds were lighting up. Activists, passengers, former employees. They were resharing it, commenting. Not all the reactions were praise. Some called it performative. Others said it should have come sooner. But Zahara didn't need everyone to clap. She just needed the right people to look, to see what they had ignored for too long. And now, they were looking. Later that afternoon, Zahara took Neela to a small bookstore in Capitol Hill. It was tucked between a bakery and a bike shop, one of those quiet places that smelled like old paper and black coffee. The kind of space where no one asked what seat you belonged in. As Nyla picked out a picture book, the clerk looked up and smiled warmly. "You're her, right?" the woman asked gently. Zahara hesitated. "I guess so." The clerk nodded, eyes kind. "Thanks for saying what most of us are too tired or too scared to say." Zahara returned the nod, soft but solid. "I didn't say anything new. I just said it out loud." That evening, as they packed their things to head back home the next day, Zahara folded the final email printout and slid it into her notebook. She didn't frame it. She didn't need to, because this wasn't a victory she wanted to hang on a wall. It was a marker, a line. And from now on, no one could pretend they didn't know where it was, because Zahara Ellison had drawn it and walked one step past it. By the time Zahara and Nyla touched down back home in Washington, D.C., the world had already changed, at least a little. There were no flashing cameras waiting at the gate, no crowds or podiums. That was by design. Zahara had asked her team to keep things low-key. She didn't want a media circus. What she wanted was continuity, quiet, honest momentum, something real. Still, she noticed the difference. The flight crew recognized her, but none said her name out loud. Just a quiet nod, a second of eye contact, and a kind of reverence. Not for fame, but for the way she had stood her ground. Not once, but again and again, without raising her voice. A young black woman working the jet bridge handed her Neela's folded wheelchair and whispered, "Thank you for not letting them silence you." Zahara smiled, simple and warm. "Thank you for seeing us." Outside, Elijah waited in the arrival zone, engine running, door already open. Nyla let out a squeal and rushed into his arms the second she saw him. Zahara followed at a slower pace, her bag slung over one shoulder, that same folder still tucked safely inside. Elijah kissed her cheek and helped her into the car. "So?" he asked, glancing at her in the rear view as they pulled into traffic. "How'd it go?" She leaned back, letting the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "They folded. All of it. Training, the audit, the fund, the apology." Elijah let out a low whistle. "Damn." Zahara smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'd think I'd feel victorious," she said quietly, "but all I feel is heavy, like I just spent a week walking uphill in shoes that didn't fit." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's because you weren't just fighting for you." She nodded. They drove in silence for a while, the city's familiar neighborhoods passing by like scenes from a life Zahara had put on pause. Back home, the front door creaked the same way it always had. The floors, the smell of cedar oil and lemon cleaner, the way the afternoon light hit the bookshelf, everything was the same. But she wasn't. Not anymore. Later that night, after Nyla had gone to sleep and Elijah was reading on the couch, Zahara sat at her desk and opened her laptop. There were over 100 new emails. Most were from people she didn't know. Teachers, nurses, bus drivers, pilots, retirees. Some stories were long and detailed. Others were just a single sentence. "They made me get off the plane. I never told anyone until now. I cried in the bathroom because I was too embarrassed to speak up. Thank you. Just thank you." She read each one. Every single one. And with every message, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel before. The cost. The real cost. Not just of speaking up, but of staying silent for so long. She closed her eyes and thought back to that moment on the flight when she stood in the galley, soaked from a careless hand, questioned without cause, forced to defend her presence in a space she had earned 100 times over. She hadn't snapped. She hadn't yelled. But she had made a choice. To speak. To push. To be seen. And now, here, at her own desk, surrounded by stories that echoed her own, Zahara felt the weight of what hadn't broken her, the strength it took to stay standing. the grace it took not to shatter. She opened a blank document. At the top, she typed, "For everyone who's ever been asked to prove they belong." She stared at the line for a moment, then began to write. Not an op-ed, not a press release, a letter. To the ones who were still quiet, to the ones who hadn't found their moment yet. Because Zahara Ellison hadn't just forced an airline to face itself, she had cracked open a door, and now she was leaving it open for others to walk through. Spring came early that year. Cherry blossoms bloomed 2 weeks ahead of schedule in Washington, D.C., dusting the sidewalks in pale pink and reminding everyone that change doesn't always wait for permission. It just arrives, quietly, softly, and then, all at once. It had been a month since Zahara's return from Seattle, since the flight, since the boardroom, since the moment everything shifted. She hadn't been on another plane since then, not out of fear, just out of intention. She wanted to give it space, let the dust settle, let the system breathe. But the work hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown. The passenger equity fund was already in motion, applications, grants, partnerships. Ether Sky had not only followed through, they had gone further, implementing changes across check-in, gate assignments, and crew protocols. And other airlines? They were paying attention too. Zahara had taken 4 meetings that week, 2 with transit unions, 1 with a National Accessibility Coalition, and 1 with a senator who had read her statement out loud on the Senate floor. She'd started getting letters from teenagers, from retired flight attendants, from immigrant families who saw her not as a headline, but as proof that dignity could still be reclaimed, even when it had been quietly denied for so long. And still, through it all, Zahara kept her mornings quiet. Every day before checking her phone or opening her laptop, she'd sit by the front window with her tea and just watch. People walking dogs, a neighbor teaching their kid how to ride a bike, mail carriers, joggers, women in scrubs heading off the night shift. Ordinary people, carrying invisible weight. People like her. One morning, Elijah came into the kitchen, holding a small envelope with no return address. "This came for you," he said, setting it on the table. Zahara opened it slowly. Inside was a short note, handwritten, simple, careful. "Dear Ms. Ellison, you don't know me, but I was the one who flagged your name that day. I was scared. I saw the news and then your video. I knew you knew it was me. I can't undo what I did. But I wanted you to know I'm working on the reasons why I did it. I've started attending the trainings. I've started listening. Thank you for holding up a mirror, even when I didn't want to look. Sincerely." Riley Zahara read it twice, then folded the note. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat there, still, quiet, grounded. Because the letter didn't give her closure. It gave her confirmation. The work was working. That afternoon, she and Nyla took a walk through the park. The little girl zipped ahead in her wheelchair, chasing a squirrel that darted under a bench. Zahara followed behind, her scarf caught by the wind, a thermos in one hand. "Mommy," Neela called, giggling. "Did you see that?" "I saw it," Zahara laughed. "That squirrel was running for his life." They laughed together, and Zahara thought about how easily this moment could have slipped through her fingers if she had stayed silent, if she had chosen comfort over confrontation, if she had accepted apology over accountability. But she hadn't, because some doors, once opened, aren't meant to be closed again. Back home, Zahara returned to her desk. She pulled up a new document, not for a speech, not for a proposal, just a note, to herself. Keep the door open, even when they try to shut it again, even when your voice shakes, even when no one claps, especially then. She hit save and leaned back, not because the fight was over, but because now, she wasn't the only one fighting, and that, more than any statement or policy, was the beginning of something much bigger. Sometimes the loudest change doesn't come from shouting. It comes from someone who chooses to stand their ground with quiet strength. Zahara didn't demand attention. She demanded dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us that real change doesn't always start with power. It starts with presence. So here's a question for you. Have you ever been in a moment where speaking up felt risky, but staying silent felt heavier? Tell us your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it. And if this story spoke to you, If it reminded you of the world we live in and the world we can build, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because around here, we don't just tell stories, we pass the mic to the people who've earned it.